Hi, I'm Father Peter Verhalen, the Abbot of Our Lady of Dallas Cistercian Abbey here in Irving. And on behalf of Matt Kramer and the whole Catholic Foundation, I want to thank you very, very much for your generosity to the Foundation. Not just your donation, but also, and more importantly, you're joining the Foundation in their mission to bring life to the local church, to bring the light of Christ to the Diocese of Dallas. Matt asked me to speak a few minutes about charity, following up on the previous two talks on faith and hope. And rather than speaking about St. Paul's comment in the letter to the Corinthians, first letter to the Corinthians, three things abide in the end: faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity. I thought I'd talk to you a minute about charity in the Cistercian tradition. Every Cistercian monastery is known as a school of charity, a schola caritatis, as we say. And in a very real way, that's true of every family. And from this idea that the monastery is a school of charity, I think we can draw lots of lessons. But I'd like to share two with you today. And the first is the very obvious lesson, that if the monastery or your family is a school of charities, charity is something that can be learned. It's a lesson. It's a habit that's acquired over time through lots of practice. And to illustrate how that works, I want to share a very moving story that I came across just in the past 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, one of our monks, the oldest member of the monastery, Father Bede, passed away at the age of 92. And in preparation for his funeral, I was in touch with his niece in Germany. And his niece told me the story of Father Bede's mother, whom I had never met. And Maria, never going beyond the 8th grade, committed this story to writing through Father Bede's niece, who wrote down what she was telling. And Maria said that in 1945, January 22nd, when Father Bede was 18 years old, the Russians came into their little village in Hungary and started rounding up 150 people to go to work in the mines in Siberia. When Maria saw that her 18-year-old son, who she knew wanted to become a priest, had been rounded up, she went to the officers and begged them to take her in his place. The officers finally relented and indeed did take her, among all these other men, to work in the mines of Siberia. When I heard that story, I thought, what an amazing story about the power of a mother's love, about this heroic willingness to sacrifice her life for her son. But then on second thought, I thought, indeed it is an amazing story of heroic love. But it's not just this love that happened all of a sudden. It was a love that had been learned over 18 years. Love is a habit that's learned. It's not a passion. It's not a feeling. Love is not something that I suffer a passion. It's not a feeling that can come today and go tomorrow. I no longer love you. But love is a habit. It's an act of the will that I learn. And Maria had studied in her school of charity of her own home what that love really looked like. She gave birth to her son, and yet she had to learn how to nurse and nourish and care for him. She had to learn how to interpret his language before he was able to use words and while he was still just using gestures and crying. And she had to learn what his strengths and his weaknesses were, what his hopes and his fears were. And perhaps most difficultly, she had to learn how to let him grow independent of her, how to let him take the risks of being on his own without hurting himself. And it was in this 18 years of schooling in the School of Charity that Maria learned to sacrifice herself day in and day out, and all of those little lessons, so that when the opportunity arose, she was able to sacrifice her whole life and give it so that Bede could stay at home and continue in the seminary while she took his place in Siberia. I think in the School of Charity, Maria learned, just as we can learn, a second very important lesson, and that is that charity is based on faith. Three things abide in the end: faith, hope, and charity. Yet the greatest of these is charity indeed, but there is no charity without faith. When she went to Siberia, we can only imagine what kind of abuse she had to suffer, whether it was physical hunger, whether it was loneliness, whether it was exhaustion from working in the mines, or any other kind of abuse we might imagine. We can only imagine how tempted she was to think that love is pointless. It makes no sense. And yet she didn't. She believed that her God is a God of love. She believed not this doctrine or that doctrine, but that love indeed prevails over all evil, that love indeed prevails over all suffering, all betrayal. And it's illustrated in one little story she tells in her longer story. As she was on the way to the Siberian mines, the train stopped and the prisoners were allowed to get off, and they were walking outside the train to stretch their legs a little bit. And the boys of the village came up and surrounded them, as you can imagine a bunch of 8th grade boys doing as a pack. And not able to speak the language, they used the international language of a hangman's noose, indicating to the prisoners on the train what awaited them in Siberia. And many of the prisoners, seeing that, ran from the boys. And yet Maria, believing, having faith, that love is all-powerful, more powerful even than death, allowed one of the boys to, in a sneaky manner, kind of sneak up to her, and he put into her hand half a loaf of bread. She believed in the power of love, and so she allowed that little boy to exercise his own act of love. And so we in the monastery here at Cistercian are in a school of charity, and you are in a school of charity as well. And my wish and my prayer for you, as it is for each one of the monks here in the monastery, is that we might learn our lessons in the school of charity. And that first lesson being that charity is something we learn over time through many little acts of charity. And second, that there is no charity without faith. Faith in a God who loves us. Faith in a God who is himself love. Faith in love that overcomes all things.